Good now, everybody, and welcome to Rise Up Eventually today. Not in the morning, not in the evening. We're so glad that you're here, whether you're listening now or in the future. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Commissioner Peirce, for making time to meet with us today. Our audience,
delighted to be here.
They think you're great. They appreciate the nuance and depth that you bring to your work. And if you're just seeing the Commissioner for the first time, you're in for a real treat. Just so you have some context, we talked a little before the interview, but our audience, they're as old as 11, as young as 82. And they are learners at all levels of experience. Some of them are curious or skeptical about blockchain. Some of them just want to invest in crypto. Some of them, want to understand how they can use it in ways beyond money as a medium to coordinate with others at scale, do the things they like better. One of our audience members is a developer. His name is Nick Junis. He said he really hopes that the U.S. can become a more innovation-friendly place, especially for entrepreneurs like him. And I know that that's been a big part of your journey. The SEC has gone from being one among many government agencies to kind of taking a central role in the crypto story. And often for our audience, it's as an adversary. There's this perception, I think, from some companies and consumers that they're being punished or that they're just being misled by people who want to take advantage of them, and also sometimes the people who say they want to help. And you yourself have said that there's been a real breakdown of trust. And so I'd like to start by getting your opinions on, can that trust be rebuilt? And what do you imagine the path to trust through regulation looks like?
Well, it's a really good question, and I do want to start with my disclaimer, which is that my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. People are very sick of hearing that disclaimer, but I think it is representative of the fact that we do have different views at the SEC. And so when people get discouraged, I urge them to look at that fact, that they're, even within the SEC, there's a difference of opinion on how we should approach these issues. And I do think we can get back to a place of trust. There's been a lot of bad water under the bridge so far, and so I think it will require some work on our part. But I think if people saw that, if we got up tomorrow and we said, okay, we're going to take a different approach here, we want to have a public discussion which involves everyone, not just a few large companies in the crypto space, but everyone. And we want to do this in a way that really susses out what are the problems here so that we can all agree on the problem set, and then we can all think about what solutions might look like. I think that would go a really long way toward repairing that trust. And I do encourage people to remember that we as regulators work for you. It isn't actually the other way around. And I think that's sort of the American spirit, is to remember that the government works for the people, not the other way. And we've lost that a little bit as a people. We've forgotten that. And so it requires some work from your side too, in reminding government officials like me that, you know what, you got to answer to me, not the other way around.
I heard you say it was about creating freedom for people to act as they please and then holding them accountable or responsible for the consequences.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other side of the coin, right? I'm someone who believes very strongly in liberty. I think adults should be able to make choices for their own lives, and that is what this country was grounded on. It attracts people who want to take control of their own lives, who want to build better lives. That's why people come here from all over the world. But the other side of that is, don't say that you love freedom and then when something goes wrong, go running to someone else to solve your problems.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Guys, the floor is yours.
Yeah, on the topic of building trust, before this, I watched a lot of videos and podcasts of you chatting. And one was on Thinking Crypto on his YouTube and podcast. And one of the things you mentioned as a response to the question of like, oh, if you could ever have the opportunity to be head of the SEC, would you take it? And you said, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in making sure the SEC gets back on the right track. So what is off track today in your mind, and what does the SEC look like when it's back on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, that it's not just a crypto problem. There are other issues with the SEC, but focusing on crypto specifically, we've sort of lost sight of the fact that we're not an enforcement agency. Actually, we're actually a regulatory agency with enforcement as one tool. And so we need to get back to the point of starting with a regulatory framework. People have questions about how does the law apply to this asset class and to this type of activity and this technology. And so we have to grapple with those questions. So that would mean our very seasoned attorneys at the SEC sitting down with people and working through hard issues. How do we achieve the SEC's objectives with this new technology? There's some challenges that are unique to it. There are also some things that make it much easier for us to regulate. So let's look at ways that we can use the technology to actually do things better from a regulatory perspective. And I think it's really that back and forth. And then you use enforcement as the tool for people who don't, at the end of the day, comply.
Yep. Okay. I have a perfect follow-up for that, Alex, if you don't mind. And that is, you mentioned like the application of the technology being beneficial for potentially, the SEC. But one of the things I really wanted to get your opinion on as well is A, if you want to expand on that, wonderful. But also, I wanted to get your opinion on what use cases you think blockchain technology could be used for that might be some of your favorite to benefit like average American people.
Yeah, and I think it's always important to caveat that with the fact that I'm sitting in my regulatory tower here and I'm not in the weeds of the tech. But I think you said something at the beginning that really resonates with me about how this technology is a way to bring people together to do the things they love to do. You said it better than I did.
Align incentives and coordinate together.
Coordinating human activity is something I find most exciting about this technology. It's a way of bringing people who don't know each other together to work together in a way that they can trust each other because of the technology, not because they know each other. That's really powerful, and I don't know where that will end up going, but I think there's potential there. So in terms of use cases, from the regulatory perspective, one thing that I think is pretty interesting about the technology is that you can take the token and you can build disclosures into it essentially so that the token is always moving with disclosures. You can have a smart contract that says these are the rules and this is how this is going to work. And that can really integrate well with securities laws.
Sure.
So if you have a lockup period, for example, you can bake that right into the technology. And I think that's interesting. I think there are some, if you took regular shares of companies and you tokenized them, there would be a way for companies to communicate with shareholders without having to actually know who the shareholders are. And I think that's a very interesting
that's
possibility.
Cool. So good. That's a perfect use case I haven't thought of before. Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of other areas where we might see, you see prediction markets. You can use a token in prediction markets. You don't have to, but you can. But could you do some of the same kinds of things with securities analysis where you bring in lots of different people's views and you're able to compensate people? I don't know. I mean, again, this is just me speculating. But I also think that decentralized finance does something that has really been very difficult for the traditional financial markets, which is it enables everyone to participate on exactly the same terms that are spelled out there for you. Now, granted, we can't all read the code, but they're spelled out there for you and they apply to everyone equally. No one gets a break from them because they just automatically, the rules kick in, your collateral gets taken because that was, you got to that place where your collateral was going to get taken. You knew that was going to be so traditionally we've seen that finance has applied different rules to different people. And so this really is an opportunity to democratize access. Now, it's not the end all and be all. It doesn't create money for people who don't have it, obviously.
Sure, absolutely.
But it does take away some of the problem that happens when you have a centralized intermediary. And I think we see this, especially now in the crypto space, where you see bank regulators saying to banks, we don't really want you to deal with crypto entities. With a decentralized finance system, you don't have that intermediary that can say, no, I don't want to deal with you, or I'm only going to deal with this kind of person and not that kind of person. So I think there's some really promising angles. Now, again, there are other things that are difficult, right? We're used to regulating centralized intermediaries. So what do we do when there isn't one anymore? If you are engaging with decentralized finance, you're going in, there's no one you can go to if something goes wrong. And so those are the kinds of things that we also have to confront and think about. But I suspect that we're going to see some areas of our lives transformed by the technology. Again, what they'll be, I don't know, because I'm just a regulator.
Sure.
Very cool.
Well, thank you. That was a fantastic response. Alex, I know you have a few questions.
No, yeah, no worries. So first of all, really quick, don't ever apologize for giving a disclosure or a disclaimer on the show. We are very big on them.
Very big fans of
That's
disclaimers.
good, yeah.
So important as we talk to tons of people who we see you always trying to pull just little bits of recommendations and what to buy and all that sort of stuff. So we are a big fan of disclaimers on this platform. So I kind of wanted to segue just a little bit because you talk about trust being an issue. I don't think that's, of course, localized just to the SEC. There's a lot of distrust of government as an institution in general, I think, given primarily to the fact that a lot of people are looking at it for the first time now. There's more and more eyes on government every year that we go by, and there's not a ton of like underlying education to, give a whole lot of context for some of the things that happen in government sometimes. And I was specifically interested in getting your opinion as someone has worked in government, especially since the SEC in particular has gotten so many more eyes on it now over the last how many years since you were originally confirmed. And just kind of like on a personal level, what has that been like to operate as a regulator now, especially with more eyes than have ever been looking at the SEC? I think I would say in its history, given the personal financial investments of so many people curious about what you guys are going to say next, what's going to happen next, what's the opinion on X, Y, and Z. What's that shift been like to go from, I don't want to say in the shadows, that makes it sound nefarious, but like
Obscurity.
Obscurity, and now having way more people looking at you and maybe not always knowing exactly what it is the SEC is supposed to be doing and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. We're 90 years old now as an agency, and it is certainly a new phase in our life to have some people actually know what the SEC is. They don't think we're the Southeastern Conference anymore. They realize we're a regulator.
There's still got a lot of confusion of that in our conversation.
There is.
There's still a lot all the time. War Eagle.
They're surprised you're not 300 pounds and 6'5".
So yeah, I mean, it is kind of a new world where people might know who we are. And some of that is good, right? Some of it is, I love seeing that people know who's regulating an industry. They're engaged with what we're doing. They're giving comments. I always say I love to live in a country. I mean, I get a lot of really negative comments.
I can imagine.
Very negative comments. But I love that we live in a country where people can say terrible things about their government and their government officials. So on the one hand, of course, it's not nice when people are saying terrible things about you. But then when I really think about it in perspective, I'm like, this is great. This person can swear at me and say that, they can't wait for me to die. But that's great because we live in a country where people can do that without, I mean, the dying part, people ought to be a little careful about, but they can swear at me and there are no consequences for that. That's wonderful. And so that's good. But then on the other hand, I think I do look forward to renewed obscurity because we shouldn't be so much a part of the story that we are right now. And the SEC's role is really to provide the parameters within which the markets operate. And then people should have a lot of freedom to operate within those parameters. And so we should just set stable rules that are going to change incrementally, but it shouldn't be this kind of thing where people are at the edge of their seats waiting to see when is the SEC going to push the button and approve those Bitcoin exchange traded products, because that just adds an element of drama that's totally unnecessary. So
Sure.
I kind of have mixed feelings on this.
I thought that was one of the notes that I had is something that I just really stuck out to me. The dissent that you put out specifically after the final approval of those spot ETFs for Bitcoin, just being, pointing out that the SEC's delay on pushing because I mean they were sitting there for ages.
Yep.
That added more volatility to the market than ever should have been presented by what could have just been a much more, procedurally typical application. If something's wrong, it's denied or it's sent back for a fix or whatever.
Yep.
And I think that is something that I find hyper interesting about your job specifically, is that, like it or not, a lot of this industry is very small. And so you guys it's got to be really hard to navigate being able to share an opinion about something, knowing that there are so many people hanging on your every word, and that things you say can move billion-dollar markets very quickly.
Well, things I say don't, because people know I'm usually in the minority, so I don't think it matters what I say. But I think, that the agency, right? I mean, and it really should not be like that. I mean, there are always going to be things that the SEC does that has an effect on the markets. But you're right; it's not a great place for us to be, and I hope that will change.
May I ask you quickly on that note about diplomacy in your work? You are a really great example of how to handle conflict productively as an agency. It seems like there is always an opinion, and then there is always a dissent. Yeah. And often in public, you are seen as speaking kind of against the voice of the agency. And I know it must be tough. Do you have any insight in terms of, I don't know, how do you guys, I don't want to ask Hester to gossip, Commissioner, for being diplomatic with your job?
Well, essentially just because also dissents are a common part of regulation and litigation enforcement, all that sort of stuff. We see it from the Supreme Court every time anything happens, but specifically with this industry, it's typically you dissenting, and that's the one that we all see and read, and then there is the other decision. So just sort of like that, navigating that in the workplace, so to speak, as knowing like, okay, we're going to go out and say this, and then Hester's going to dissent, and then everyone's going to talk about that, and just sort of,
Or even with Congress people, you encounter people at all levels of experience like us, and at all ends of the spectrum in terms of their values, their beliefs, the kind of things they come to work thinking. How do you navigate that productively?
So I think it's good to remember this is a battle of ideas at the end of the day, right? We're fighting for what we want this country to be. The SEC was set up as a commission. There are 5 of us. We're politically balanced. So it was intended that there'd be a vigorous debate about all kinds of issues. And so I think no one is surprised to have, some passionate views on both sides. It is really important to focus on the ideas and not on people, right? Because that's what our country is about. We're not a country of kings. We're a country of Americans, all of whom are exactly equal, of citizens, right? Everyone is equal status. And so I think it's great that we have debates, and I think it's great that people are involved in those debates, and you can have intellectual and personal respect for someone and disagree vehemently with what that person is advocating in terms of policies moving forward.
I wish you were running for president. Now, one of the things, just like on the topic of like change that you mentioned before, is I'm checking my notes. Yes, the Chevron doctrine was repealed, well, I guess a little while ago now. But how have things changed since then regarding the SEC's approach to the crypto industry? Because before then, it was very much so with a cudgel in hand, as opposed to an open hand for collaboration and trying to find clarity through litigation and enforcement action. So how have things changed that you've noticed in the SEC since the Chevron doctrine was repealed?
Yeah, and just so that people have context, I'm impressed that, I'm sure a lot of your listeners and watchers do know what it is, but Chevron is a court-made doctrine that essentially the courts would give deference to agencies. And so the Supreme Court, there was a case where they said, that Chevron deference is no longer a thing. And so that means that agencies don't necessarily get deference in terms of interpreting the laws that govern us. So it's a much bigger issue than just a crypto issue. It's a much bigger issue than just the SEC. It affects agencies all across the government. We've always had to be careful about making sure we stay within our statutory authority. That doesn't mean that we've always stayed within our statutory authority, but courts have raised questions about what we do. So we do have to be careful. And I think to the extent that it underscores that you've got to have solid legal grounds for what you're doing, that's totally fine. And that we need that reminder, because as you've seen in the crypto space, we're just on this, jurisdictional eat as much as you can rampage, and So to be reminded, hey, you guys only have authority over what you actually, Congress has given you authority over. And so I think anything that helps to remind us of that is not a bad thing. But Supreme Court gets to make those decisions. That's outside of our purview.
We've had a lot of conversations, kind of obviously just speculating because it's very hard to get insight, but in the wake of Chevron being overturned, just about, no longer having that deference as an agency, but also given the fact that we're kind of trying to figure out how to govern and push this industry forward, which is very new. So there's not a lot of precedent that exists to determine how you guys approach stuff. So I wonder if you can comment just a little bit on the process of like establishing new precedent as you see things within the crypto industry that you've never had to encounter before, you've never had to figure out how to regulate before, given that, turning a ship like the U.S. government is obviously not like whipping it on the lake with a wakeboard behind you, but it's a lot harder to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good way of thinking about it. How does that precedent get made? And it's typically through courts. Well, you're seeing that play out now, right? Courts are considering specific fact patterns and are making decisions. And so some of the people who are observing this area say, well, this is exactly what it should be. I mean, securities laws are broad and they're written to be timeless. And so something new comes along and you figure out how it slots in. And as the court cases develop, you develop the law. But I think the problem is that we see this stuff coming down the pike. We realize, there's some areas where, like NFTs, let's take that area and say, here are some things that NFT creators should be thinking about. Here are some things that are totally not within our jurisdiction. Here are some things that might be within it. We could have done the same thing with crypto lending programs. Provide some parameters for people to think about. And so I guess I would say this would be an opportunity for us to provide guidance, maybe to write some rules. Of course, Congress might decide to come in and say, no, we think this is new enough that we need a new regulatory framework, because some of this stuff might actually not be in anyone's jurisdiction right now.
Sure.
And so maybe Congress decides we want to create a jurisdiction and we want XYZ agency to run it. And so I think it really just requires us to be humble, and where we see a regulatory gap, we can point it out. I might not think we need to fill that particular gap. Someone else might think, oh yeah, we need to fill it. But we can see the gap, point it out. It doesn't mean we have to jump in and say, okay, we're going to try and claim it as our own.
I think that's so interesting, just because we talk about a lot, the application of the Howey test to different things. And we've gone over before, what are the prongs and how do they apply? And I've always found that interesting, just because there's not a tremendous amount of wiggle room, like with, at least in my opinion, and granted, this is just as a layperson, with like looking at the way that someone has sold a digital asset to somebody else, with the overt advertising about, this is your salvation, this thing is going to be worth billions of dollars and all that sort of, like, there's not really a lot of room for interpretation. Like, you can look at that and pretty simply say, like, you can't talk about it that way. And yet there still seems to be this monumental debate about deciding whether or not X token is a security or this one is a security, or, and especially with how many people touch all these different things. I just think that's very interesting.
So it is. And I'd like to give another caveat, which is that I always urge people to be skeptical. Someone's promising you'll make a ton of money at something. Someone's promising this is going to be life-changing wealth for you. Be very skeptical. And
absolutely,
someone saying to you, you have to invest today, otherwise you're going to miss out, run the other direction. Because if it's a good thing, there's going to be another opportunity for you to invest in it.
It's like when you hear that, people typically say like 9 times out of 10. No, like 10 times out of 10. 10 times out of 10, run away.
Now, real quick, Bill mentioned...
but I do want to get back to...
Oh, go ahead.
But keep going. Yeah, I want to just get back to that point for a second.
Please, continue.
So on the Howey point, so I think we really need to do some thinking about Howey, not only with respect to crypto, but just more generally, because there are lots of instances where you might sell something and you might say to someone, this is going to go up in value, right? And you don't want to have a world where you can't tell someone that, the Stradivarius you're selling is going to go up in value. That might not be a good example, but, you're buying a
a home in a nice neighborhood.
Home in a nice neighborhood. You're buying a car, and the salesman is telling you this is going to be worth so much money in 10 years because the company is putting a lot of effort into building the brand. They're hiring really, well-known actors to promote it. So if we interpret Howey as we've been interpreting it with crypto, it could get really big really fast, and we could be regulating everything in the world pretty soon. So I think maybe it's time for a little bit of thinking about, does it really make sense to have such a broad interpretation, or might we want to really have it anchored to something that's more concrete and that's more meaningful, right? Because you don't want to live in a world where someone's building a blockchain and can't tell you, hey, this blockchain is going to work really well. Well, I mean, what do you expect them to say? It's going to be a fail. So,
Sure.
So having an actual investment contract, it doesn't have to be a written contract, but having something that actually means there's a responsibility, I think it is something that we should be looking for. And I think applying it in the token context has been particularly problematic because we've never lived in a world where there have been investment contracts that have traded so much on secondary exchanges. So sorry to get us off track, but that's
not at all.
I think we need to think about that area.
It's extremely important, and you're the pro. And I wanted to make time because I know our time is coming to an end very quickly. Before we get to final thoughts, when I was talking with Bill, who is delightful, by the way, he mentioned that we should leave time to ask you about fundamental American rights, fundamental rights for Americans. And I was just curious, what does that mean to you? And is there anything else before we go that you'd like to say to our audience? I specifically wrote down, what is it, Bill? The Investor Advocacy Education Board, the IE?
Well, first of all, we do have a website that people can go to if they want access to resources. A lot of it is reminding you to be careful about crypto promotions. So that's one thing. That's investor.gov. Put a plug in for that. But I think one point that we should remember is the debates we're having now are bigger than just about crypto. You cannot be interested in crypto and you can think these debates are still important because it's about what American people can do, and it's about whether they're driving the bus or the government is driving the bus. And ultimately, as we started out, the government answers to the people. And so there are real concerns around financial privacy for Americans, around just autonomy for people to make their own financial decisions. And we have to have these discussions, and people really need to be engaged in those discussions. So that was really a point that I think sometimes gets lost in this discussion because we're so eager to get the regulatory clarity that we want to throw those points out and not pay attention to them.
The difference between making sure the environment is safe to experiment and invest in versus dictating what people are able or not able to invest in.
Exactly.
And it's one of those things that's always lined up with the thought I've always had, which is that the crypto kind of movement is very democracy and freedom and liberty friendly and should be seen by everyone on every political aisle and everyone in the world. So,
I heard somebody say it's as bipartisan as toasters. Being in favor of good tech like the internet.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are American fundamental values that we can all come around. And we all have an interest in having markets that are safe for investors, but also encourage people to try new things. Sometimes that means failure is going to happen. Sometimes that means you're going to, say, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, invested in that. But you learn something for the next time, right? So even, let's just build an environment within which we can more easily identify the bad actors, but also build that area of freedom for people to do what they want to do.
Well, I'd like to invite everyone to just give a final word to thank our audience for joining us today. And my final thought, we always invite people to give their questions, suggestions, good jokes, words of wisdom. So I'd like to offer you that opportunity too. But first, I have a very important question for you, Commissioner Peirce. We, as you know, love blockchain. We love gaming. We love fantasy. And we observe that in many of your dissents, you reference popular culture, you reference Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, that apparently you have an interest in apiary. Would you describe yourself like we do as a nerd?
As a nerd?
A nerd.
I'm
absolutely
a nerd, yeah. Absolutely.
I knew it. What, do you guys have anything for the commissioner?
No, now I just want to talk
In fact, I will say I went to one interview once at a law firm, and at the end of the interview, the person said to me, you know, we hire nerds too. And I thought, well, it's written all over my face, I guess.
Gentlemen, is there anything
No, I
else to
just-
say except thank you?
Well, I want to thank you all. I mean, it's been a delight to talk to you. I'm sorry that we had to cut it off. I would have liked to hear more from you all. So,
Well, the invitation is always open to you when it's less hectic, when you have time. I know the elections are coming up. You have a lot of changing things, priorities, but you are welcome on our platform anytime. Bill is welcome. We'd be glad to host you for another round, and we know how to
let
get
me know
you.
when you're in DC. And to your viewers, I'd love to hear from you as well.
What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
You can reach out to Commissioner Peirce at sec.gov. That's the best way. Just email that, and it'll eventually work its way to me.
Awesome. Well, we'll have links for that in the description. We'll get you in touch with the commissioner with the resources at the SEC. Thank you very much for being the best part of what we do, and thank you, Commissioner Peirce, for making
you
time
so
for
much.
Yeah,
us
thank you
today.
so much.